Okay, no, I thought we were going to start with my dear sister, but I will definitely start. Let me first say I want to salute my dear brother Cliff and sister Dorothea, who are the visionary founders and leaders of Labyrinth. Give them a hand, please. We are so glad. We're so glad you're here in Princeton. Indeed. And I want to thank my dear sister Virginia for facilitating this gathering. Very much so. For me, I go all the way back with Brother Mumis Abu-Jamal, that he has been a freedom fighter going back to his membership of the Black Panther Party. And when he, in fact, was incarcerated, I was thoroughly convinced that he was innocent, so I was concerned about him getting a fair trial. And then when I discovered that some of the witnesses had, in fact, put forward some mendacious formulations, I was even more determined that he have a fair trial, because as someone, both as a human being, as a democratic citizen, and as a Christian, I'm concerned about the preciousness and pricelessness of each and every person, and therefore I want a fair criminal justice system, and that includes a fair trial for Mumis Abu-Jamal. In addition, he's one of the great jailhouse intellectuals. Now, he's written this wonderful book on jailhouse lawyers. But he is one of the great jailhouse intellectuals. He's a prophetic voice, and he tries to tell the truth about America from the vantage point of the least of these. Echoes both of the 25th chapter of Matthew, but also as an intellectual, he's concerned about the poor. He's concerned about working people. He's concerned about gay brothers and lesbian sisters. He's concerned about hatred against Jews, hatred against Arabs, and most concerned about a critique of the corporate greed that has been pushing the Democratic project nearly off the cliff in the last 25 or 30 years. And so you say, why, Brother Mumis Abu-Jamal? One is because he deserves a fair trial. I'm convinced he didn't do it. Two is because he's a prophetic voice. And three is because he forces us to come to terms with the depths of the crisis of the American empire, of the American civilization, and how do we try to somehow get some democratic accountability of the greed on Wall Street, the connection of greedy oligarchs to our often spineless politicians in the White House or State House, and how do you create some awakening so that we can somehow shatter the sleepwalking among those Sly Stone called everyday people?
Well, I don't know whether I'm going to be discussing the end of empire, but I certainly want to acknowledge my debt to the organizers of this event. By the number of people in this room, you can see that it's not as boring as some people think to be living in Princeton. And it's true. Also, I want to add that I accepted this invitation. I'm very grateful to Dorothea and to Virginia. But what they don't know is that I mostly accepted this invitation because it gives me an opportunity to actually interact with Cornel West, who is so big and so busy that is not sufficiently available. So here we are thrown together into this conversation. But in all seriousness, I think that one of the things that is wonderful about this gathering is that it allows us to consider people who are behind bars and to acknowledge them not only as part of our humanity, but also their membership in our common social body. The book that is being celebrated today, Jailhouse Lawyers, is a welcome addition to a growing literature that makes clear there is vibrant life behind bars. Not solely the chaos and violence exploited by programs that you may have seen on television like Lock Up, which I cannot stomach, but the invisible acts, the acts that we have deliberately as a society made invisible of intellectually able individuals who toil and struggle under difficult circumstances to prove they are human. And before we go on to the larger subjects, and I realize that it's Mumis Abu-Jamal who is the subject of this conversation, but let me, as a social anthropologist, as a member of the Department of Sociology at Princeton, put this into some perspective. Some of my favorite people in the world are in this room right now, and so you already know that. But for those of you who perhaps imagine that this question about imprisonment is simply kind of a fussy subject of charity and connection, I would like to place incarceration in some kind of perspective. We have more than 200,000 individuals living behind bars, and that does not include, by the way, and I will not bring it up, undocumented aliens in detention centers. Most of those who are behind bars are men. We have about the largest incarcerated population in the world. And what really, really irks me, the reason that I think this is so important is that the risk of imprisonment is not evenly distributed throughout the population. If you are African American and male and young, you have about 9 times more, 9 times more likely that you will end up behind bars. The same is true about large numbers of Latinos. And so these are also the folks who do not receive adequate education or investment on the part of the society when they are very young. So the way I try to put it to my students is that you get punished at the beginning of your life, and then you get punished as you become an adult, because we do know that the likelihood of incarceration is much higher among young men who live in poor neighborhoods, who have low levels of education, and upon whom the society has not invested adequately. And I believe that is totally inconsistent with the ideals of democracy and the institutions that regulate this country. Now, Mumis Abu-Jamal is possibly, I agree, the most famous prisoner in the world, and we must be grateful to him because many prisoners cannot sustain the kinds of conditions that exist in American prisons. And yes, I know that there are prisons throughout the world that are probably worse, but for the kind of country that we are, for the traditions that we have, the conditions are horrible. I know because for several years I worked hand in hand with prisoners at the New Jersey State Prison, and I took many of my students to work with them on the publication of a prison magazine. Because, you know, as I used to say, my Princeton University students really do deserve to go to jail. And they often went to go to Vail. Now, unfortunately, I was banned from prison, which gives rise to all kinds of jokes in my circle, because you probably have never met someone who is not wanted even in prison. And especially, I regret that because I was uncharacteristically well behaved. And despite that, as the authorities, with total impunity, decided that they did not want to continue educational programs on behalf of prisoners, I was collateral damage. It wasn't even really personal. So a lot of the people that I know behind bars are people who cannot have this kind of event. And so Mumis Abu-Jamal, who has this notoriety, who's famous, and who has the intelligence and the education to write the books that he writes, really becomes a very important representation of a dimension of prison that most of the people in the United States are not acquainted with. And I believe that is a very important thing. Final comment. It surprises me because, you know, no matter how we cut it, Mumis Abu-Jamal, when he calls us here, which we hope he will be able to do, is calling us from death row. That requires a lot of consideration because, as far as I'm concerned, it still surprises me that arguments continue to be ventilated in this country about the legitimacy of the death penalty in this civilized country. Only a few authoritarian regimes and the United States insist on destroying prisoners as a punitive measure for crimes. And all this in the face of incontrovertible facts that make clear the death penalty is not only inhumane but ineffective. And I would like to just mention that, as you probably know, and this is an educated audience, more than 200 prisoners, and this is not a popular cause. So when you actually have more than 200 prisoners freed after many years of imprisonment, who have been in death row as a result of the application of new DNA-based technologies, you have to wonder how many other people are in prison who should not be there.